Rebecca and I decided to begin this talk tonight, which will focus primarily on our climate catastrophe. But there was another kind of catastrophe yesterday, one that has happened all too often in our country for too long. I think most of us know that yesterday, 19 young children and 2 teachers were killed in Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. And I think it's really important for us to take some moments to bear witness to the grief and the horror that so many are experiencing at this time. And it is also, I feel, really important for us to not only bear witness, but to commit to action. And that action is, among other things, to urge our representatives to ban assault rifles instead of books. Come on, Texas. And to protect our children and not the lobbyists. And to end gun violence by passing legislation that will protect our lives. And not to wait. And I'm going to be a tough old Buddhist. I'm going to just say those who vote against such legislation need to be voted out. I know Rebecca and I are so on the same page about this. So I'm very grateful to see my old friend. I want to just say a few things about Rebecca's background. You can read her bio. I don't know how many bios you're going to have to write in your lifetime, Rebecca. But in any case, we know that Rebecca is a renowned writer, a historian, an environmental and a social activist. She's on the front lines in so many different ways. And she's the author of more than 20 books on feminism, Western and urban history, on social change and insurrection, on wandering and walking, and on hope and catastrophe. And her books include this beautiful latest book, Orwell's Roses, such a wonderful book. Hope in the Dark, which has inspired me so much. I just, so many of the ideas, not only, the situations that you're describing in Hope in the Dark, which are so powerful and uplifting, but so many of your ideas around hope became the kind of seeds for my own work in Wise Hope. And then Men Explain Things to Me. Thank you. Been there, been through it. A Paradise Built in Hell, the extraordinary communities that arise in disaster. And I am hoping that out of the various hells that we're living in now, we can, and this is something that Christine Figueres and I have talked about, and also so much is in your heart. How do we actually use the catastrophes that we're in, that are intersectional catastrophes, to actually learn from and build a collaborative world in relation to the natural world that is sane and generative? And then you make the note that you're a product of the California public education system from kindergarten to graduate school. And, California did okay by you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Roshi. That was because I thought somebody needs to name drop public education, because I've heard private education name dropped. So I was like, I'm just going to do that in my bio. And thank you. And I've been thinking about a paradise built in hell with the terrible fires that I know are so close to you and people and places you know and love. You know, the climate crisis, which not long ago people talked like this bad thing that might happen, is all around us in so many ways. And it's now. We're in it, and we have to figure out how to go forward.
Well, one of the things that you're doing right now, which I think is so cool, is you're putting together this climate project called Not Too Late, which is the name of your talk and some reflections from me, perhaps, which I think is really important for us to recognize, because I feel that so many people are in the grip of futility. They think the game is over. Actually, the game is one that we're learning from, and it's not too late.
Exactly.
So go for it, Rebecca. Well, one other thing, you know, Rebecca and I have walked trails in California and New Mexico, but most preciously, Rebecca served in Upaya's Nomads Clinic in Dolpo over a number of years, and you were just so humble and so efficient and taking care of so much. And this is a project that brings healthcare to people who live in high altitude remote villages in this region called Dolpo in Nepal. And I think that work has touched us deeply. So, Rebecca.
Yeah, Not Too Late is a project to try not just to assuage climate despair to make people feel better, but hopefully to be a gateway people step through to become fully engaged in climate activism. We need everybody on board. The future is not yet decided. Everybody agrees this is the decade of decision. By everybody, I mean climate organizers and climate scientists. We don't have that much time to choose the better outcome than the worse outcome. And what I found over and over was that people really thought it was too late. And there's a number of stories that are spread very widely, I think very much in the United States, that ordinary people have no power. We have no victories. We don't change anything. All we can do is nicely ask the powerful to give us what we want and wait to see if they feel like it. The same thing could apply to gun control or voting rights or things like that. And so I really wanted to address the deep grief, despair, anxiety, fear, and moral sort of horror that people feel about climate change. And I felt that part of it was an informational crisis. If you're not kind of deep in the weeds with us climate organizers, you often hear it's too late, which is not true. You know, it's too late for there not to be climate change. In a way, we're like somebody who's been given a terrible diagnosis, but a diagnosis that there is treatment for. I've seen people, I'm sure you've seen a million more people, where their first response is, oh my God, I'm going to die, and this kind of overwhelm. And then often the next response, if you listen carefully, is there's actually something we can do about it. And it will never be as though I never got sick, but maybe I'll live and thrive and change. And, you know, people have these things you talk about a great deal, the kind of post-traumatic growth experiences from difficulty and illness. So the climate crisis is a kind of global illness, and it's not a death sentence for the planet or even for the human species. It does mean that everything's going to change. And so I think that's one of the problems. People think we have no power. They think it's too late. Often I hear that nobody cares, and that's often a sign of somebody who's not yet engaged. One of the beautiful things about engaging is you meet the people who do care, and you see that they're doing things, and that it's like being in a Buddhist community. You join a community of deeply ethical, deeply committed people. So, and this really springs out of the work I've been doing for a long time. 19 years ago last month, I published an essay called Hope in the Dark. 18 years ago, a book of the same title that was really trying to rethink this book that you mentioned, really trying to rethink how change works, to meet the same kind of despair when I ran into it when the Iraq War began, the sense that we have no power, we can't change anything, the elites hold out all the power, that it's futile, a kind of despair. And I think we have to completely respect despair as an emotion while constantly reminding people that it's not an analysis. And it's often mistaken as an analysis. You can feel absolutely terrible and yet recognize that it's still worth trying. So, and A Hope in the Dark was very much about the fact that change doesn't look like a lot of people in this culture of kind of instant results guaranteed or your money back think it should look like. It's often not indirect, it's not immediate. And we also tend to think that history is, I think as America has been a very stable regime, if not a very stable country, that everything's going to proceed in a very predictable way. And yet we can learn even from the pandemic, even from the invasion of Iraq, that suddenly the world can change overnight for the worse, for the better, just be profoundly different. That life is deeply unpredictable and that things people don't anticipate. And, I was so influenced as a young woman by the collapse of the Soviet satellite countries through civil, nonviolent civil organizing, much of it with deep roots in culture and spirituality, in things that looked very small and ineffective at the time, the same way the abolitionist movement or the women's suffrage movement. When I've seen so many things with great indirect consequences, the ways the Standing Rock pipeline protests inspired Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to run for office and win and introduce the Green New Deal in Congress. One of the things I spent today doing was writing a letter to some people who were involved who felt like because the Green New Deal didn't pass in Congress, that they had failed. And I just feel like the Green New Deal did so many things. It did not pass, but it's actually the basis for Build Back Better, which may yet pass, even though that hasn't passed yet. So I really wanted people to have much more complex, nuanced senses of how change works, how our own power works, a sense of our own history of victories, and, and a sense of hope, which for me is a really Buddhist thing, a coming to terms with the unpredictability of it all, with the uncertainty of the future. And despair is, in a strange way, a kind of confidence that we know what's going to happen. And again, the pandemic, the invasion of Iraq, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, so many surprises in my lifetime, the sudden appearance of the Zapatistas on the world stage, the way activists changed the quincentennial, Indigenous activists changed the quincentennial of Columbus's arrival in 1992 from a celebration of imperialism, colonialism, and genocide to a beautiful expression of resistance that really rewrote the stories. So I see all these things, and I think part of the climate crisis, like every crisis, is an imagination crisis. We need better stories. We need stories that remind us of the power we have. We need stories that remind us that we have changed the world before. We need stories that remind us how unexpected so much of the world we live in is, how unimaginable it is. And one of the things I want to ask you soon, Roshi, is just like how inconceivable the world of 2022 might have been to you in 1972, let alone 1952. Okay, 1952, you were too young. So Not Too Late is really a project to bring people better stories about change, about the power of ordinary people when we come together, about the open-endedness of the climate crisis and the room for us to intervene, and the stories of our past victories that remind us that we know what to do, and when we do it, it can work. So yeah. Not too late. Thank you.
Not too late. Rebecca, what you're speaking in a way is this kind of brilliant perspective on a Buddhist ethos. And this ethos is reflected in notions of resilience. What is it to be pliable? What is it to be nimble? What is it to be sort of pressed to the ground and pop back up? And I've been looking at this in relation to, a number of things, including, what has happened to healthcare workers during the course of this pandemic, which has been really catastrophic, not just for the people who have made their way through the pandemic suffering from COVID, or the family members who've lost, others in COVID. How do we learn from these incredible challenges that we're facing, and how do we cultivate resilience? And I'm really grateful you mentioned imagination, because I've found there are 7 kind of key factors in relation to the experience of what it means to be resilient, that are reflected in our Buddhist practice. And imagination is one. Not just to imagine the worst, but it's our capacity to actually be able to reframe very difficult situations in a way that's generative. And when I say generative, I don't necessarily mean always, positive or happy, but generative. It's not like a unidirectional gravitational surface story, a black hole story, so to speak, where you just drop down the pit and there's no way out. You mentioned it is this capacity to really be dwelling in better stories, which I think you're a real genius at, by the way.
Thank you.
I love it. And just to mention a few more things, in talking with my old buddy, Richie Davidson, the neuroscientist, one of the things that he feels is very important in the experience of practice is how it actually opens up our capacity to be more adaptive. Adaptivity is a really important capacity in terms of our survival. And whatever is going to happen in the future, and we can't know even in the next minute, it is the capacity to adapt, to see things as they are. And it's like this line from the Denko-roku, which I often cite, Zen Master Keizan, where he says, "Do not find fault with the present. The present is as it is. Our response to it, in terms of resilience, is calling toward greater flexibility, greater adaptability." A few more things that I want to mention, and one of them is developing our ability to actually share positive emotions. Just as your new endeavor, Not Too Late, is a way to say, hey, the game is not over. We're in it. We're in the threshold part of it. We're not in the end game at all. And that affects, if you look at the work of Nicholas Christakis in terms of spheres of influence, our capacity to actually influence the Sangha or people around us by 1, by 2, by more. And we've seen this, in a weird sort of way, vis-a-vis this virus. And we're talking about here as a positive virus. Our capacity to actually influence the well-being of others through the sharing of positive emotions. And I think one of the most important things, and we come back to this again and again in relation to our Buddhist view, and that is the role of ethics. What is it to cultivate a strong moral character that manifests a strong ethic of care and ethos of care? And of course, in Buddhism, ethics, if you will, or the precepts are in a way the sort of hinge or at the very heart of our Eightfold Path. So moral character is really important. What is it to be an individual of integrity? And thus being, in that field of integrity, our capacity to be more resilient is enhanced. There are a few more things I want to just say in this piece on resilience, because I think it's so important for us at this time, Rebecca, since many people are experiencing moral injury and a sense of moral outrage as well. And, one feels it in your work. I feel it at Upaya. And that's this sense of meaning, of purpose in our lives, in what we're doing in service to others, and also efficacy. But, this work that you're speaking about, Not Too Late, in terms of spheres of influence has, tremendous potential, but even efficacy in terms of warm hand to warm hand, person to person, bearing witness to the grief of one person, allows us to really build a sense of character and also meaning in our lives. And another thing, I think that we both experienced this when we were working in Nepal, and that is how important it is to have a strong team or a dedicated community where there's a sense of respect, of safety, of reliability, of connection that is present. The sort of Lone Ranger ethos or Dick Whittington ethos, the sort of lone guy out there and, doing the sort of hero's work is not adequate. It doesn't enhance our resilience. It's really through Sangha, through community, that our pliability, our nimbleness is enhanced. And the seventh piece for me is realizing the profound value of compassion, what it means to be able to actually have the attentional capacity to be grounded and to perceive things really clearly, and as well to have deep concern about the well-being of others, and to have the capacity, of concern so present that we actually have the motivation to be of benefit to others. So I wanted just to mention these things because I think at this time, what we're facing is a very interesting opportunity that we don't want to squander.
Never waste a good crisis, I think, is your motto.
Yeah, never waste a good crisis, and we're in one. We're in a good one. And from the point of view of systems theory, Rebecca, even as the institutions that we're part of, that we're serving in, might appear to be so fraught, and it might, more than appear, might be very fraught. But what we know from complex adaptive systems is that when systems break down, they actually have the potential to reorganize themselves at a much higher and robust level of functionality when we learn from the breakdown.
One of the things that's actually kind of exciting about the climate crisis is there's only one way to solve it, and it involves making a better world. The status quo is not stable. It will have to go. And the language around climate has been very kind of austere. It's been talking about renunciation. Oh, we have to give things up. And we should, maybe we're not going to fly as much. But what if we told a completely different story? What if we talked about, we live in a world that's poisoned by fossil fuels. It's literally poisoned from extraction, which is so often in Indigenous and people of color's lands. It's poisonous when we refine it. Here in the Bay Area, it's the Black and Latino community of Richmond that gets the brunt of it. It's poisonous when we burn it, whether it's our gas stoves indoors, we're now acknowledging are really toxic, and, or in our cars and the emissions. And it's destroying, it poisons, it acidifies the oceans, etc. But it also has poisoned our politics. The Putin regime, Saudi Arabia, the oil interests and their impact on the US government. And fossil fuel has been utterly toxic for a century and a half. And so we're asked to renounce, but to renounce poison. We're asked to renounce the centralized power that's been so corrupt and violent, as we can see from Putin, who's essentially a fossil fuel emperor, and so many other terrible things, at play today. And so we need to make a world that decenters power literally with solar and wind and electrifies everything, but also a world in which we're much more attuned to the natural world, in which how we raise crops, how we build things. Everything has to be more attuned to the natural world, to the long-term consequences, to not just to the very narrow range of kind of individual profit that's driven capitalism, but to the well-being of the whole and the system. We have to stop thinking of a world of isolated objects, which is the world of profit. You know, even in talking about climate, there's a term, I'm not sure I can recall it without everyone watching my face for a while I call it up, but externalized costs, which means Exxon doesn't pay for all the damage it's doing. We have to have no externalized costs. And so it demands that we build a world of ordinary public power and public good being much stronger, and decentralized power, a cleaner world. Christiana Figueres in her book has a beautiful passage about what the world might look like if we do what it needs. And there was an amazing moment at the beginning of the pandemic when suddenly a huge amount of fossil fuel burning stopped, and people in northern India could see the Himalayas for the first time because the air was clear for the first time in decades. And it was kind of a shock. People all over the US heard birds singing because it had become much quieter. So we actually, you know, it is an imagination crisis, and both in the failure to imagine how dangerous our situation is, and the failure to imagine that it could actually be made much better, and the failure to imagine our own power. And imagination is a survival skill, says a wonderful novelist and prisoner advocate I know named Renee Denfield. If you can't imagine your life changing, you can't make the steps to change your life. And the same is true of collective life. So I think often of the climate crisis, the deep imaginative failure of people who have no empathy, who intentionally do harm, is the fossil fuel magnates and fossil fuel oligarchs. And the failure of imagination of people who think we live in a stable world and don't really believe climate change is real. The people who believe climate change is real but don't imagine that we can respond to it adequately. And finally, the people we really need, who are out there, and we just need to amplify them, the people who have the imagination to perceive the crisis and the imagination to perceive that we have the solutions, as the great banner in the 2014 climate march said. We don't need some gizmo brought to us by Bill Gates. We don't need technology that doesn't exist. We already know what to do. And some of it is very humble. One of the really exciting things that happened this winter is people in Britain engaged in blockades and fierce protests for insulation. And insulation is not a sexy issue in most people's imaginations, but insulating homes means that they're much more efficient, so they need to use a lot less fossil fuel, or if you convert to renewables, electricity. And in a capitalist society, a lot of poor people in cold places can't afford their heating bills. So it was like a social justice issue, that was a climate issue, and young people were blockading streets in London for it. One of the things that makes me hopeful is every day I go look at all my news sources, including a lot of smart climate people on Twitter, and every day I find out about some movement, some legislation, a lawsuit, a campaign, a community addressing the climate crisis brilliantly that I didn't know about the day before. It's just, you know, and some days there are victories. Australia, after 20 years of domination by these coal barons who are utterly horrible on climate change, voted in a Labour government allied with Greens that has promised to make climate the top issue. And like, you know, the world changed dramatically because Australia's been a major obstacle, as the US was during the Trump administration. But sometimes the world changes suddenly overnight, and sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better. So that's all part of my climate hope.
Well, I think there's another important thing, and that has to do with what we're learning from Indigenous peoples. You know, for millennia, they've had a sacred and a practical relationship to the lands and waters that they live with. And I think what is really interesting now is, you know, we're beginning to give attention to ecological practices that have come right out of the Indigenous world. And, you know, even the predatory process of colonization, which disrupted the lifeways of so many Indigenous peoples, but still traditional ecological knowledges. And I like Stephanie Kaza, she says, put it in the plural because it is true. Everything is context dependent. these knowledges that have been acquired over thousands of years, sometimes lost, but fortunately not entirely. And I think,
Knowledges and values
yeah,
and beliefs and commitments.
and my sense, Rebecca, is that learning from Indigenous peoples about ecosystem management and restoration is something that is really important for us to turn to now. I appreciate what we've learned from Western science, in order to dial down the impacts of this exploitive and extractive relationship with the earth. But I also feel that not just the technologies in the sense of on hands, but the values that are reflected in the Indigenous world are really essential for us to give deep attention to.
I think one of the tremendously exciting things of the last 30 years is that both Buddhist ideas and Indigenous ideas have circulated and influenced a huge number of us. A lot of people may not even know those influences came to them, but some idea about respect, about inclusion, about openness, about compassion has reached them. And, we are not who we were a few decades ago in values. But the Indigenous leadership is also profoundly practical. One of the things I'm really proud of is I'm on the board of Oil Change International, and we put out a report last summer with the Indigenous Environmental Network. I have my notes here that says Indigenous resistance has stopped or delayed greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 1/4 of annual US and Canadian emissions.
Oh.
1/4.
Wow.
And that is huge power. And that was one of the things, back to what made me hopeful. I remember with the Indigenous kind of uprising against the quincentennial of Columbus's arrival, the rising of the Zapatistas, feeling like, oh wow, these people have been told they were the past, they were over, they were doomed, they were going to be extinct, they were obsolete, are going to lead us to a better future. And it's come to pass in so many ways. And so many exciting things are happening, showing that the change is here. The Save the Redwoods League was founded about a century ago by one of the worst white supremacist eugenicists in the country. And there was this absolutely evil false equation between protecting nature and centering whiteness and as superior. And of course, all us white people are, we're not necessarily invasive species, but, we're settlers. And the Save the Redwoods League has done a 180-degree turn. The former director, I hear they have a new director who's a woman of color, but the recent white male director wrote a beautiful recognition, full acknowledgement, full responsibility, and apology. But more than that, they bought 5,000 years of old growth redwood and gave it to the Sinkyone Matol tribe to manage. And that's just something that I think not only 100 years ago when those eugenicists were running rampant, but even 25 years ago, I don't think most environmental groups could have conceived of such a thing. One of the joys of getting older, which for me has been seeing the arc of change. And Martin Luther King famously said, the arc of justice is long, but it bends towards justice. And we could argue it's bent a few interesting, surprising ways recently. But living a long time and also being what I call historically minded, you get to see these long arcs. And, it is really exciting. And it's a lot of what gives me hope. There's a wonderful theologian. I want to just throw out a quote from him. Christian, but awesome. Walter Brueggemann, who said, memory produces hope in the same way that amnesia produces despair. And so the kind of memory of the past, seeing that we're building on work that people have done and seeing in the present people are doing it wholeheartedly and seeing that the future's, ours to make if we get together, if we try hard enough, if we can get enough people on board is kind of what keeps me going. And here I should say, hope is not optimism, which is a confidence that everything will be fine no matter what you do, which essentially, like despair, imagines that the future already exists or is inevitable, and therefore nothing is asked of us. Hope makes huge demands on us. It saddles us with responsibility, a hope that I think for me is not very different than a Buddhist sense of uncertainty. We don't know what will happen. We, out of compassion, out of care, and out of hope, We want to intervene for the best possible outcome. And, you know, not naively, but with wisdom of people who might understand the processes, whether it's passing legislation, influencing publics, at building better energy systems and all the rest.
Rebecca, I have to smile because I know you're not a big Twitter fan, but every once in a while I'll get on Twitter and I'll see something that just really causes a lot of mirth in me. And this is from some person named Matthew, and he wrote about hope. And he said, people speak of hope as if it is this delicate, ephemeral thing made of whispers and spider webs. Then he writes, it's not. Hope has dirt on her face, blood on her knuckles, the grit of the cobblestones in her hair, and just spat out a tooth as she rises for another go.
I'm happy to say one of the lines in Hope in the Dark is, hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on the couch with feeling lucky. It's an axe to break down doors within emergencies. And I believe a few people have gotten axe tattoos as a result. Oh. So my only tattoo influence in the world, but that's a whole other subject. But yeah, it's, it's an imagination question.
It takes moral nerve to be hopeful.
It does. It's a risk. It's like love. It can fail. You can feel betrayed and abandoned. It's safer not to love anything or anyone, but it's also a failure to live, a failure of what life might offer you, a failure of possibility. You have to risk, and you have to risk losing. And it's also with the climate and anything else, if you don't, if you try, you might lose, but if you don't try, you will never win. And that's also something that, it's kind of more like gambler's odds than deep philosophy, but just to tell people, because one of the things I run into is people want to know for sure what's going to happen. I think people really treat the future like it already exists, and some people have been there. And I feel like they talk about it like it's Paris, like, oh, you've been to Paris. What's it like there? Tell me about it. And nobody's been there, and nobody knows. One of the things I was looking at today is I read a bunch of news stories from early 1989. Nobody expected the Soviet bloc to liberate itself through nonviolent, direct action and civil society resistance. Nobody foresaw it. Nobody expected it. And some of it happened accidentally. They accidentally announced that the Berlin Wall was no longer guarded and opened. And if the people on both sides of that wall hadn't flooded the wall, they might have kept up that barrier longer, but it fell in a night because of an accidental announcement and tens of thousands of people's bravery going to a place where you used to get shot for trying to cross, and just, some of them going with sledgehammers to literally take it apart, speaking of hope as an axe. And so we see this deep uncertainty that I think is grounds for hope, and this deep possibility of intervention.
And I think another issue, Rebecca, has to do with this sense of us wanting immediate gratification for what we're doing. I remember this line from Václav Havel where he said, hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. And I remember I heard this kind of joke. Somebody asked the Dalai Lama, well, what do you think of the French Revolution? And he paused and he looked at the person who asked the question. He said, well, it's too early to tell. So, we might not make it as a species. Many species might not make it and won't make it. But as you say, we don't know what's going to happen in the next moment. And so what we're really, I feel, again, this is so much out of a Buddhist ethos, is what is it to show up? What is it to do something that in that moment makes sense, regardless of how it turns out?
One of my favorite new quotes about hope is Mariam Kaba, a Black prison activist, who says hope is a discipline. And I love that because people want hope to be a feeling, and we're very invested in our feelings in this country. you know, and that's how I think people take despair for an analysis, or you can't be hopeful if you're sad, if life is difficult, if it doesn't look easy. And, you know, I think you can. And hope is in part a commitment. And even beyond that, I think there's a kind of faith. When you look at these tiny, feeble beginnings of great movements, one of my favorite hopeful books is Adam Hochschild's Bury the Chains, about 12 Quakers meeting in some back room in the mid 1770s. And Quakers are politically disenfranchised in the Britain of that time, but they decide to abolish slavery in the British Empire. And of course, with the participation of slaves and former slaves, you know, and other people, they build a movement, and only one of them lives the 50 years to see that it will happen. None of the women who decided women should have the vote in the 1840s lived to 1920, of course, to see the 19th Amendment passed. You know, both of my grandmothers, probably your mother, were born without the right to vote. And one of my grandmothers, I think, was an adult before she got that right. So the world changes, and you see that arc, and you see these things that start very small. The abolitionist movement of the 1840s is like these nice little groups of people, women selling handicrafts at little fairs to raise money for these very small speaking campaigns and stuff. And then you know, the Civil War comes, and you know, and you know, the world changes in utterly unexpected ways. And it's most of all the faith of people who start something when you can't possibly feel like this is going to be victorious. Václav Havel became the president of a liberated Czechoslovakia. But in the 1960s and 70s, he was a playwright with subversive ideas who went to prison regularly. And those ideas, this wonderful rock band in Czechoslovakia called the Plastic People of the Universe and stuff, these cultural means were putting out subversive ideas that were ultimately the seeds of the trees that would break the concrete that covered everything and let the, you know, little things see the sky again. And so these stories of the past, because the past is what we can know. It's why I think this hope and memory are so coupled, you know, and they also feel like they're not quite roadmaps for the future, but they're kind of training grounds of what you can expect, how things work. And I agree with you so much. There is this sense I constantly see. We did this on Tuesday. We made demands on Tuesday. We didn't get them on Wednesday. And two exciting victories in the last 10 years for the climate movement took 10 years. The protests, I was at the beginning of the protests against the Keystone XL pipeline. Lots of people were like, oh, don't bother, you'll never win, etc. Biden finally issued the death certificate last year for Keystone after 10 years of hard-fought battles. But they did so many other things, created coalitions, educated people, including me, about the tar sands in Alberta, how toxic they were, and how we had to kind of like, prevent their profitability. And another thing is Harvard students organized a divestment movement. So the divestment movement, I was there when it was founded, partly by Bill McKibben and 350.org, and people sneered at that, but it educated everybody about how our money funds climate catastrophe. $40 trillion has been divested, and the valiant students, you know, many crops of them, because they kept graduating, which is a thing that happens to student movements. Last year, Harvard, after 10 years, finally divested. And, you know, for year 2, year 3, through year 9, you could have said, oh, this isn't working, it's a failure. And a lot of things take a while. And I think another thing Buddhism teaches is patience, and maybe not so much attachment to outcome.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well,
did we just wrap it up?
We just wrapped it up. I'm so happy that you mentioned the paramita of patience. Very good. And
Thank you.
No attachment to outcome. This is wonderful. I think our conversation could roll into the next hours and days and weeks, but we are at the end of this session. Thank you so much. And we will, just two things. One is the Varela Symposium, the Varela International Symposium is happening on Saturday and Sunday this weekend. It is incredible, where the real leaders in this field that Francisco Varela established decades ago are coming together from Europe and the United States to look at exactly what we're exploring now. And that is that we are not separate from the very context of our lived experience. And then the following weekend, we're doing a really important program called Planting Life with Indigenous scholars, talking about the very issues that we are addressing today, the lifeways, values, and traditional ecological knowledges of the Santa Clara peoples, and also Melissa White talking about her perspectives on ecology, and Stephanie Kaza, Wendy Johnson, and others. So it's very cool. These two things are following each other. So please join us, everyone. It's only donation. Everything Upaya is donation. We exist because of donations. You make it possible. And we'll finish this evening with the 4 Bodhisattva vows, and deep gratitude to you, Rebecca, for everything that you bring to the world every day.
Thank you, Roshi. I'll stick around for those vows. And thank you, listeners, as well. Thank you, Climate Movement. Keep hope alive.